Still renting, my father announced, his voice carrying easily across the hushed, ambient noise of the private dining room. Your sister owns 2 houses. You are the real disgrace of this family. My mother nodded in immediate agreement, a perfectly rehearsed gesture of disappointment. The entire table fell completely silent. I did not argue. I just put my phone down flat on the mahogany wood. When my father aggressively snatched it up moments later, the color drained entirely from his face. He had no idea he was my tenant. My name is Hazel. I am 33 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a real estate investment executive, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The private dining room at Prime Cut, the most exclusive steakhouse in downtown Chicago, smelled of aged beef truffles and unearned arrogance. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the heavy oak table where my family sat, celebrating my father Richard and his 60th birthday. It was a milestone event that required the kind of lavish spending my family always prioritized over actual financial stability. For the past 3 hours, I had sat in the corner seat, quietly sipping my sparkling water while enduring a continuous stream of subtle insults and overt bragging. My sister Felicity, who had just turned 30, sat directly across from me. She was dressed in a designer silk gown that I knew cost more than her first car, constantly adjusting her hand so the light would catch her massive diamond ring. Next to her sat her husband Colin, a 35-year-old bank manager who wore his custom-tailored suits like a suit of armor. My mother, Patricia, reigned over the table with an air of absolute superiority, ensuring that every conversation ultimately circled back to Felicity and her supposedly perfect life. The dinner had been an exhausting marathon of excess. They had ordered the most expensive items on the menu, including 2 bottles of vintage imported wine that cost roughly $800 each. Tomahawk steaks, lobster tails, and truffle fries cluttered the table. I had ordered a simple house salad and a single glass of house wine, knowing exactly how these family dinners usually ended. As the plates were finally cleared away by the attentive staff, the head waiter approached our table carrying a sleek black leather folder. He stepped naturally toward my father, the guest of honor, and the patriarch of the family. My father took the folder, opened it, and barely glanced at the astronomical total before snapping the leather shut. With a swift, practiced motion, he slid the heavy folder straight down the center of the polished wood table. It glided across the smooth surface and came to a dead stop, exactly in front of my empty salad plate. I looked down at the gold-embossed logo on the leather, then looked up at my father. He was leaning back in his plush leather chair, swirling the last few drops of his expensive red wine, with a look of absolute entitlement on his face. "Pay up, Hazel," my father said, his tone carrying the sharp edge of a command rather than a request. "You have no family to support, you have no children to feed. You are 33 years old and living alone in some rented box. The least you can do is contribute to the meal of the truly successful people sitting at this table. Consider it a tax for your lack of ambition." The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The total on the receipt peeking out from the leather folder was $3,500. I stared at the numbers, feeling a familiar coldness settling in my chest. This was their game. This had always been their game. They used money and status as weapons to bludgeon me into submission, to remind me of my designated place at the very bottom of the family hierarchy. I was the scapegoat, the designated failure, the one they kept around strictly to make themselves feel vastly superior. I reached out and rested my fingertips on the cool leather of the folder. I did not open it. I simply pushed it slowly and deliberately back across the table until it rested in front of my father. "I am not paying for your birthday dinner, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of the emotional reaction he was desperately trying to provoke. "I ate a $20 salad. You and your guests consumed the rest. I suggest you hand the waiter your own credit card." The silence that followed was deafening. My father lowered his wine glass, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. Felicity let out a sharp, mocking laugh that shattered the quiet room, her eyes glittering with malicious delight at the opportunity to tear me down. Unbelievable, Felicity scoffed, shaking her head so her perfectly styled hair cascaded over her shoulders. You are always so cheap, Hazel. It is actually embarrassing to watch. Colin and I just closed on our second house in the suburbs yesterday. A gorgeous 5-bedroom estate with a pool. We understand how to generate wealth and celebrate success. You are still throwing your money away on rent every month. It is no wonder you cannot afford to treat your own father on his 60th birthday. Colin chuckled, adjusting his silk tie with a condescending smirk. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, mansplaining with the confidence of a mediocre man who married into what he believed was old money. Renters like you will never understand the elite investment mindset, Hazel Cullen explained, his voice dripping with patronizing pity. When you rent, you are just paying someone else's mortgage. You are building someone else's empire while your own net worth remains stagnant. Felicity and I leverage our assets. We build equity. That is how the real world works. Maybe if you paid a little more attention to our financial strategies, you would not have to panic over a simple dinner bill. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, letting his arrogant words hang in the air. The absolute delusion at this table was staggering. They were sitting here lecturing me about elite investment mindsets and building empires completely unaware of the reality of their own financial ruin. I looked directly into Colin's smug eyes. Elite investment mindsets, I repeated, letting a cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. Is that what we are calling it now? Is an elite investment mindset exactly like the time Mom and Dad forced me to sign away my entire college fund at 18 years old just to pay off the massive debts from Felicity and her failed luxury candle boutique? My mother Patricia slammed her open palm down on the table with such force that the crystal wine glasses rattled violently against the plates. Her face instantly flushed an angry mottled red as she rushed to defend her golden child. How dare you bring that up? Patricia practically screamed, her voice losing all its previous sophisticated polish. That was completely different, and you know it. She is your sister. She has immense creative potential, and she needed capital to explore her entrepreneurial spirit. You studied economics just to be a corporate drone. You lacked vision, Hazel. I was entirely right to redistribute those funds to someone who actually knew how to dream big. You should be grateful you even get invited to sit at the same table as us. Now stop making a scene, pull out your credit card and pay the bill immediately so you do not embarrass us any further in front of Colin. The sheer toxicity of her words washed over me, but instead of the crushing pain I used to feel as a teenager, I felt absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. I looked at the family that had spent decades trying to break my spirit. I saw my father puffing out his chest, trying to look wealthy and commanding. I saw my mother desperate to maintain the illusion of high society dominance. I saw my sister hiding behind a diamond ring that I knew for a fact was bought on heavily leveraged credit. And I saw Colin completely oblivious to the financial quicksand he had married into. I am not paying for your illusions, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet tone that finally made Felicity stop smirking. I am not paying for your vintage wine, and I am certainly not paying to maintain the lie that any of you are actually successful. If you cannot afford the lifestyle you are pretending to live, perhaps you should not book the VIP room at Prime Cut. My father slammed his fist on the table, leaning so far forward his face was inches from the floral centerpiece. You ungrateful little brat, he growled, his voice vibrating with rage. You think you are so smart with your cheap apartment and your meaningless little corporate job? You think you know everything about money. Do not ever lecture me about what I can and cannot afford. I just dropped $2 million to secure a luxury penthouse in the Vanguard Tower downtown. I live at the very top of this city, while you scrounge for rent money at the bottom. You are a failure, Hazel. You always have been, and you always will be. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms loosely over my chest. A $2 million penthouse, I said, tilting my head slightly. That is a very impressive purchase, Dad, especially considering your credit score. The moment the words left my mouth, my cell phone, which was resting face down next to my water glass, vibrated violently against the wood. It buzzed once, twice, then a third time indicating an urgent priority alert from my private business server. I did not reach for it. I simply kept my eyes locked on my father, watching the veins bulge in his neck as his temper reached its boiling point. My father, always needing to be in absolute control, always needing to invade my privacy and find new ways to humiliate me, saw the phone vibrating. With a sudden aggressive movement, he lunged across the table and snatched my phone from the wood. "Let us see who is messaging the great renter on a holiday weekend," he sneered, gripping the device tightly. "Probably your landlord begging for the rent money you cannot afford because you are too busy being useless." He flipped the phone over, pressing his thumb against the screen to wake it up. Because I had my notifications set to display the full text of priority business alerts, the message glowed brightly against the lock screen. I sat perfectly still, watching his face. I watched the arrogant, cruel smirk slowly slide off his features like melting wax. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as they scanned the words on the screen. I watched the flush of angry red drain instantly from his cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and pale under the crystal chandeliers. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands began to tremble so violently that the phone shook in his grip. The message displayed clearly on my screen was a direct automated alert from the internal management software of Vanguard Real Estate Holdings. It read, "Priority alert. Past due notice. Luxury penthouse lease for client. Richard has officially reached 60 days late. Eviction process initiated. Please authorize lock change protocol." My father stared at the screen, then slowly raised his terrified eyes to look at me. He looked at the logo on the notification, then looked at the daughter he had just called a worthless renter. The silence in the private dining room became thick and suffocating as the reality of his fabricated life came crashing down in real time. The facade shattered instantly. Richard slammed my phone face down on the table, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as panic morphed into unhinged fury. "You hacked my phone!" he bellowed, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You hacked my personal data just to humiliate me in front of my son-in-law. You are a psychotic, jealous failure." Felicity gasped dramatically, covering her mouth with her manicured hand, while Colin stared at Richard in sheer disbelief. Colin's entire perception of his wealthy father-in-law was crumbling before his eyes. Patricia immediately leaped to her husband's defense, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "How dare you!" Patricia screamed, pointing at me. "You illegally accessed your father's financial records. I am calling the police right now. I will have you arrested for cybercrimes and thrown in jail where you belong. You have always been a vindictive, hateful child." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply raised my hand and gestured toward the far corner of the restaurant. Right on cue, a tall, sharply dressed man in a tailored black suit stepped out from the shadows of the neighboring dining area. He walked with measured, authoritative strides directly toward our table. This was Ethan, my senior legal counsel, and the head of corporate acquisitions for my firm. He carried a thick leather briefcase stamped with the official gold crest of Vanguard Real Estate Holdings. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," Ethan said, his voice deep, resonant, and entirely professional. He placed a heavy stack of legal documents directly in the center of the table, right next to the $3,000 dinner bill. My client did not hack anyone's phone, and she certainly did not illegally access any personal data. Patricia paused mid-rant, her phone frozen halfway to her ear. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, her eyes darting between Ethan and the documents on the table. "And who is your client?" Ethan adjusted his suit jacket, his expression completely neutral. "I am Ethan, senior legal counsel for Vanguard Real Estate Holdings, and my client is sitting right in front of you." He gestured politely toward me. The notification on her phone was generated by our internal system because Miss Hazel is the chief executive officer and sole owner of the Vanguard portfolio. She does not just rent apartments, she owns the entire luxury skyscraper you currently reside in. The heavy silence that blanketed the table was absolute. Richard looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His mouth hung open, his eyes darting frantically from the legal documents bearing my name as the sole proprietor of a multi-million-dollar real estate investment trust back to my face. Patricia sank slowly back into her plush chair, the color completely draining from her face. Colin sat frozen, his elite finance brain trying desperately to process the fact that the woman he had just mocked for being a poor renter was actually a real estate tycoon who owned his father-in-law's building. "You own Vanguard." Richard choked out his voice, barely a raspy whisper. "The entire building." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small. "I own the building, Dad," I said softly, "which means I am your landlord. And as of 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, you are officially evicted." The heavy silence in the private dining room was shattered by a sharp gasp from my mother. Patricia scrambled to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the polished hardwood floor. The color that had previously drained from her face came rushing back in a furious mottled red. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face, her diamond bracelets clinking wildly. "You are lying!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing off the expensive wood-paneled walls. "This is some kind of sick, twisted joke. You hired this actor to come in here and humiliate your father on his birthday. I am calling the police right now. I will have you both arrested for fraud, extortion, and criminal harassment." She reached for her designer handbag, digging frantically for her phone. Ethan did not even flinch. He adjusted his glasses with complete professional detachment and tapped the thick stack of legal documents he had just placed on the table. "I strongly advise against calling the authorities, ma'am," Ethan said, his voice cutting through her hysteria like ice. "Filing a false police report is a serious offense. The documents before you are notarized, stamped, and filed with the state of Illinois. They include the original corporate charter of Vanguard Real Estate Holdings, naming Hazel as the sole founding member. They also include the deed to the luxury high-rise your husband currently resides in. If you look closely at page 4, you will see your husband's own signature on the lease agreement, right next to the corporate seal of my client's company." Colin, who had been sitting in paralyzed silence, slowly reached out and pulled the documents toward him. As a bank manager, he understood legal paperwork better than anyone else at the table. His eyes scanned the heavy bond paper, reading the legal jargon, the state seals, and the unmistakable proof of ownership. He flipped to the lease agreement, tracing my father's signature. Colin swallowed hard, his face turning an ashen gray. "Patricia," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "These are real. She really owns the building." My father slumped back in his chair, looking like a deflated balloon. The arrogant patriarch who had spent the last 2 hours lecturing me about his elite lifestyle was now nothing more than an aging man drowning in debt, facing imminent homelessness. He stared at me with eyes full of a strange mixture of terror and disbelief. Watching the reality click into place for my mother was like watching a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The moment Colin confirmed my wealth, the furious shrieking stopped instantly. Patricia lowered her phone. The angry red flush faded from her cheeks, replaced by a chillingly smooth, practiced smile. She smoothed the front of her silk dress and took a slow, calculated step toward me. "Hazel, sweetheart!" Patricia purred, her voice suddenly dripping with maternal affection. "Why did you hide this from us? You must understand how hurt we are that you kept your success a secret from your own family. But you have done so well. A real estate tycoon. I always knew you had my business sense." I stared at her, feeling a profound sense of disgust. The whiplash of her toxic pivot was astounding. "Since you are the owner," Patricia continued, reaching out as if to take my hand, but stopping when I did not move. "This whole eviction nonsense is just a silly misunderstanding. You are family. Family helps family. You can easily just clear your father's past due balance in your system. In fact, since it is his 60th birthday, it would be a beautiful gesture to just transfer the deed of that penthouse into his name. Consider it a thank you for everything we have done to raise you. It is the Christian thing to do, Hazel." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible. The woman who had proudly admitted to stealing my college scholarship just an hour ago. Transfer the deed. I repeated my tone conversational but razor sharp. A thank you for raising me. Tell me Patricia does that. Thank you cover the years of emotional abuse. Does it cover the 18-year-old girl who had to work 3 jobs because you drained her tuition account to fund Felicity and her doomed luxury candle business? Does it cover the fact that you literally just demanded I pay a $3,000 dinner bill because you thought I was a worthless failure? My mother's fake smile twitched. Hazel, do not be petty. The past is the past. We are talking about your father's home. And I am talking about my property, I replied coldly. I owe you nothing. The eviction notice stands. The building security team will be at your door at 8 tomorrow morning to escort you off the premises. If you refuse to leave, Ethan will have the police remove you for trespassing. My father buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic groan. But Felicity could not handle the shift in power. For her entire life, she had been the golden child, the center of attention, the undeniable success story. Watching me dismantle our parents was more than her fragile ego could bear. Felicity slammed her hands on the table and stood up, towering over her husband. Her eyes flashed with desperate arrogance. Mom! Dad, stop begging this miserable person, Felicity commanded, her voice shrill and trembling with indignation. You do not need to lower yourselves to beg for her dirty money. She might have a company on paper, but she has 0 class. She will always be the family outcast. You do not need her stupid apartment. Felicity turned to me, sneering with a false sense of superiority. You think you have won, Hazel? You think kicking our parents out makes you powerful? Well, guess what? They do not need you. Colin and I are the real elite here. We have actual, tangible wealth. Mom, Dad, you can pack your things and move into one of our properties tomorrow. We have the new estate in the suburbs, and we still have my luxury condo right in the heart of downtown. We take care of our own. She looked down at Colin, expecting him to back her up, but Colin was staring at his empty plate, a deep frown creasing his forehead. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the predatory grin of a woman who had spent the last 5 years quietly setting traps, waiting for the perfect moment to spring them. Felicity had just walked right into mine. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers. 2 properties, Felicity? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. The suburban estate and the luxury condo downtown. That is a very impressive real estate portfolio for someone who has not held a steady job in 6 years. Of course it is impressive, Felicity spat back, crossing her arms defensively. It is called passive income, Hazel. It is called leveraging assets. Things a corporate drone like you only reads about in textbooks. I turned my head slightly, keeping my eyes locked on my sister's panicked face. Ethan, I said smoothly, would you mind enlightening the table about the current status of my sister's highly leveraged passive income? Ethan did not hesitate. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a second, distinctly different folder. This one was bright red, signaling severe financial distress. He walked around the table, completely ignoring Felicity's sudden intake of breath. He did not place the folder in front of my sister. He placed it directly in front of Colin. Colin looked down at the bold black letters printed on the front of the red folder. His eyes widened, his mouth falling open as the blood rushed from his face. The financial jargon printed on the cover was something any bank manager would recognize instantly. It read, "Reverse mortgage default. Foreclosure proceedings imminent." What is this? Colin demanded, his voice trembling as he looked up at his wife. Felicity, what the hell is this? The word evicted hung in the air like a physical blow. My father, Richard, shrank back into his plush leather chair, his chest heaving as he stared at me. The arrogant patriarch who had spent the last 2 hours lecturing me about his elite lifestyle was now nothing more than an aging man drowning in debt, facing imminent homelessness. He looked at the gold-embossed legal documents resting on the polished mahogany table, and his jaw moved silently, unable to form a single coherent word. Patricia let out a strange, strangled noise that sounded like a deflating balloon. The angry red flush that had dominated her features faded completely, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. She looked from me to Ethan and then to her husband, seeking some sort of reassurance that this was all a terrible nightmare. Finding none, she sank further into her seat, her heavily jeweled hands trembling in her lap. But Felicity could not handle the shift in power. For her entire life, she had been the golden child, the center of attention, the undeniable success story. Watching me dismantle our parents and assert absolute dominance was more than her fragile ego could bear. The reality of my wealth threatened to shatter the entire foundation of her fabricated identity. Felicity slammed her hands on the table and stood up, towering over her empty salad plate. Her chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor with a loud, echoing bang. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her eyes wide and manic with desperate rage. "This is a scam!" Felicity shrieked, her carefully styled hair flying around her face. "All of this. It is a pathetic, sick joke." She stomped her designer heel against the floor, turning to her husband. "Colin, tell them she is lying. You expect us to believe that you own Vanguard real estate. You, the girl who wore thrift store clothes to high school, the girl who majored in finance just to sit in some depressing cubicle. You do not have the brains or the pedigree to build an empire, Hazel. This man is an actor. Those documents are fake. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter spinster trying to ruin my family because you have none of your own." I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The water was ice cold, matching the exact temperature of my blood. I looked at my sister, watching the frantic desperation mask her deep-rooted insecurity. "I do not need to ruin your life, Felicity," I said, my voice perfectly level, echoing in the quiet room. "You have done a spectacular job of ruining it yourself. You spent your entire adult life chasing the appearance of wealth instead of actually building it." Felicity let out a shrill, forced laugh. "You are insane," she spat. "I am a successful entrepreneur. Colin and I have tangible wealth. We just closed on a suburban estate. We own a luxury condo downtown. We have millions in passive income. You are a renter playing pretend. I want actual proof right now, or I am calling the police for harassment and corporate espionage." Ethan stepped forward, his expression remaining entirely neutral. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second, distinctly different folder. This one was bright red, signaling severe financial distress. He walked around the table, completely ignoring Felicity's sudden intake of breath. He did not place the folder in front of my sister. He placed it directly in front of Colin. "If you require immediate verification, Mrs. Blackwood," Ethan said, adjusting his glasses, "I would be happy to place a call to your husband's regional director at First National Bank. My client, Miss Hazel, is their largest commercial account holder. I am sure your husband's boss would be thrilled to confirm the identity of the woman who controls 50% of their commercial deposits. Shall I put him on speakerphone?" Colin shot up from his chair, his face completely panicked. "No, Ethan, please do not call him." Colin turned to Felicity, his voice echoing with sheer desperation. "Stop talking, Felicity. Just shut your mouth. If Vanguard pulls their accounts, my branch will go under. I will lose my job. I will lose everything." The absolute terror in Colin's eyes confirmed what my presence had already stated. The illusion was dead. But Ethan was not finished. He tapped the red folder sitting in front of my brother-in-law. Furthermore, Ethan continued, his tone clinical and precise. "As part of Vanguard's recent acquisition of distressed debt portfolios, we purchased several outstanding loans from your primary lender. The documents inside that folder detail the current status of your highly leveraged passive income." Colin looked down at the bold black letters printed on the front of the red folder. His hands shook violently as he flipped it open. His eyes scanned the financial jargon, reading the legal terms and the unmistakable proof of ruin. It read, "Reverse mortgage default. Foreclosure proceedings imminent." "What is this?" Colin demanded, his voice trembling as he looked up at his wife. "Felicity, what the hell is this? It says here that the suburban estate we closed on yesterday was financed using the downtown condo as collateral. But the condo already had a reverse mortgage on it. You took out a second line of credit without telling me. You forged my signature on these loan documents." The color completely drained from Felicity's face. The massive diamond ring she had been flashing all evening suddenly looked like a heavy shackle. Mom, Dad, she whined, turning toward our parents for support. Tell him Hazel is lying. Tell him she hired this man to forge these papers. My mother, Patricia, who had just moments ago been completely silenced, now looked at her golden child with absolute horror. Patricia cared about one thing and one thing only, which was the illusion of high society wealth. Watching her favorite daughter get exposed as a fraud in front of a bank manager husband was her worst nightmare. Felicity, Patricia whispered, looking at the red folder. Is it true? Are you losing the condo? I am not losing anything, Felicity shrieked, her voice pitching an octave higher than normal. She turned her rage back to me, slamming her fists on the table again. You did this. You hacked our accounts and stole our money. You have always been jealous of my success. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers. I did not hack anything, Felicity. I simply bought your debt. You leveraged properties you could not afford to buy clothes you did not need to impress people who do not care about you. And now the bill has come due. My father, Richard, slumped further into his chair, breathing heavily. He looked from the eviction notice bearing his name to the foreclosure notice bearing his daughter's name. The man who had demanded I pay a $3,000 dinner bill as a tax for my lack of ambition was now staring at absolute generational financial ruin. Hazel Richard croaked, his voice stripped of all its previous arrogance. He reached a shaking hand across the table toward me. Hazel, please. You have made your point. You are successful. You won. But you cannot do this to us. You cannot throw me out on the street. You cannot let your sister go bankrupt. We are your family, your blood. I looked at the hand reaching out to me, the same hand that had snatched my phone away, the same hand that had signed away my college fund. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the clean, sharp edge of clinical detachment. Blood is a biological accident, Dad, I replied, keeping my hands neatly folded in my lap. Family is a choice you all made very clear over the last 33 years. You chose to view me as an ATM when you stole my scholarship. You chose to view me as a failure when I refused to pretend I was someone I was not. You chose to invite me tonight solely to mock me and force me to pay for your extravagant lifestyle. Patricia suddenly burst into dramatic tears, burying her face in her manicured hands. We were trying to motivate you, she wailed between loud, gasping sobs. We wanted you to be driven like Felicity. We did everything out of love. I stared at my mother, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion. Your version of love is a poison, Patricia. I spent years trying to earn it until I finally realized it was not worth having. You wanted me to be like Felicity. Well, look at her now. I gestured toward my sister, who was standing frozen, her chest heaving as she stared wildly around the room. She was bankrupt, facing divorce from a furious husband, and about to lose everything she owned. Felicity shook her head, her eyes wide and manic. She grabbed her cell phone from the table, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. No, she whispered, then louder. No, I do not believe any of this. You are trying to steal my life. She stepped away from the table, dialing a number frantically. I am calling my lawyer, she screamed, pointing the phone at me. I am calling Harrison Caldwell. He is the best litigator in Chicago. He will expose you, Hazel. He will tear your fake company apart and put you behind bars. You hear me? You are going to jail. Go ahead and call him Felicity, I said, gesturing toward her phone. Put Harrison on speaker. Let us all hear what the best litigator in Chicago has to say about your forged loan documents. Felicity glared at me, her chest heaving as she punched the screen of her phone. She slammed it down onto the mahogany table right next to the crystal wine glasses. The phone rang loudly, echoing in the tense silence of the private dining room. 1 ring, 2 rings. My father held his breath. Colin simply stared at the red folder in front of him, his face a mask of absolute despair. Felicity, what is it? Harrison Caldwell's voice came through the speaker, sounding irritated and tired. Do you know what time it is? Harrison, you need to help me right now, Felicity practically screamed, leaning over the table. My psycho sister and some fake lawyer are trying to blackmail me. They hacked my bank accounts and forged a bunch of foreclosure documents to make it look like I am bankrupt. They are threatening my husband. I need you to file a restraining order and sue them for everything they have. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. A fake lawyer, Harrison asked, his tone shifting from irritated to cautious. Felicity, who exactly is sitting at that table with you? Ethan leaned forward, adjusting his suit jacket. Good evening, Harrison. Ethan said, his deep voice perfectly calm. This is Ethan Vance, head of corporate acquisitions for Vanguard Real Estate Holdings. I hope the merger paperwork our firm sent over to your office this morning met your approval. The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the restaurant. Ethan Harrison's voice cracked, completely losing its previous authority. Ethan Vance, what are you doing with Felicity Blackwood? I am representing the CEO of Vanguard. Harrison, Ethan replied smoothly. Miss Hazel, who happens to be your client's sister. We are currently executing a foreclosure on multiple properties Mrs. Blackwood leveraged using fraudulent signatures. I assume you are not advising your client to pursue litigation against our firm. Harrison let out a sharp, frantic breath. No, absolutely not. Felicity, listen to me very carefully. I am dropping you as a client effective immediately. Do not call this number again. Harrison! Wait! Felicity shrieked, grabbing the phone. You cannot do this. You are my lawyer. I am the senior partner of a firm that Vanguard just hired for a $50 million retainer. Harrison snapped, his voice rising in panic. I am not losing my biggest corporate client because you committed federal bank fraud by forging your husband's signature on a commercial loan. You are radioactive, Felicity. Get another lawyer, and for your own sake, do not say another word to Ethan Vance. The line went dead with a sharp click. Felicity stood frozen, the phone slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the hardwood floor. The illusion of her perfect elite life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked at Colin, her eyes wide with panic, trying to formulate a lie that could possibly save her. Colin, sweetie, she stammered, reaching out to touch his arm. I can explain. It was just a bridge loan. I needed the capital to maintain our lifestyle, to keep up appearances for your partners at the bank. I was going to pay it back. Colin flinched away from her touch as if she had burned him. He stood up so fast his chair crashed into the wall behind him. You forged my signature on a reverse mortgage, Colin yelled, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. Do you understand what you have done? I am a regional bank manager, Felicity. When this foreclosure goes public, the board will launch an immediate investigation. I will lose my license. I will lose my career. I could go to federal prison for your sick obsession with looking rich. Colin, please, Patricia begged, standing up and reaching across the table. Her face was stained with tears, her mascara running down her cheeks. Do not abandon her. She made a mistake. We are family. We can fix this. Hazel can fix this. My mother spun toward me, dropping entirely to her knees right there on the expensive restaurant floor. The proud, arrogant matriarch who had spent decades treating me like dirt was now crawling on the hardwood, her diamond bracelets scraping against the floorboards. Hazel. Please, Patricia sobbed, grabbing the hem of my skirt. You heard him. She could go to jail. Colin could go to jail. You have billions of dollars. You own skyscraper buildings. You can wipe out this debt right now. You can pay off the bank. Save your sister Hazel. Save her marriage. I am begging you. I will do anything. I will be the mother you always wanted. Just write a check and save our family. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I felt no satisfaction. I felt no pity. I felt exactly nothing. I stepped back, pulling my skirt out of her desperate grip. Save her marriage? I asked, my voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. The way you saved my future when you drained my college scholarship account. Save her finances the way you saved mine when you threw me out of the house at 18 because I refused to co-sign a loan for her doomed candle boutique. I looked up at Colin, who was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. Colin, I suggest you contact your own legal counsel immediately. Vanguard will not pursue criminal charges against you if you can prove you had no knowledge of the forged signatures. But you need to act fast. Colin did not hesitate. He looked at Felicity with pure, absolute disgust. I am filing for divorce tomorrow morning, Colin said, his voice shaking with fury. "Do not come back to the house. I am changing the locks." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the private dining room, not looking back once, as Felicity collapsed into her chair, sobbing hysterically. My father, Richard, let out a guttural roar of anger. Seeing his golden child abandoned and his wife crying on the floor pushed him over the edge. He lunged across the table, grabbing a heavy steak knife, his face purple with unhinged rage. "You ungrateful, vicious little brat!" Richard bellowed, knocking over wine glasses as he tried to reach me. "I will kill you. I will take everything from you. Take." Before he could take another step, Ethan moved with terrifying speed. He grabbed Richard's wrist, twisting it sharply until the knife clattered uselessly onto the table. Ethan shoved my father hard back into his chair, pinning him down with one hand pressing firmly against his chest. "Make another threatening move toward my client, Richard, and I will have the police drag you out of here in handcuffs." Ethan warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Sit down and shut up." Richard gasped for air, holding his wrist, his bravado completely extinguished. He sank into the chair, looking like a broken, pathetic old man. Ethan released him and picked up his briefcase, snapping it shut. He looked at me, nodding slightly. I adjusted my coat and picked up my purse. I looked at the three of them, the family that had tried to break me every single day of my life. They were sitting amidst spilled wine, cold steaks, and the absolute wreckage of their fabricated lives. "The eviction team will be at your penthouse at 8 in the morning," I said, addressing my father, who would not even look up at me. "The foreclosure on Felicity's properties will be filed by noon." I pulled a single $20 bill from my purse and dropped it onto the center of the table, right next to the massive leather check folder. "That covers my salad," I said, turning toward the door. "Happy birthday, Dad. Good luck with the bill." My father, Richard, slumped heavily into his chair, his chest heaving as he stared at the foreclosure documents. The man who had demanded I pay a $3,000 dinner bill as a tax for my lack of ambition was now staring at absolute generational financial ruin. He looked from the eviction notice bearing his name to the foreclosure notice bearing his daughter's name. "This is your fault!" Felicity shrieked suddenly, pointing a trembling finger at me. She spun around, her eyes wide and manic with desperate rage. "You set me up. You bought my debt just to humiliate me. You ruined my marriage. You hacked our accounts and stole our money. You have always been jealous of my success." I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers and looking at her with cold, predatory satisfaction. "I did not hack anything, Felicity," I said, my voice perfectly level, echoing in the quiet room. "I simply bought a bad loan and read the paperwork. You leveraged properties you could not afford to buy clothes you did not need to impress people who do not care about you. You ruined your own life. I am just the one holding the mirror." "Mom, Dad," Felicity cried, reaching her shaking hands out to them across the table. "You have to help me. Colin locked me out. I have absolutely no money. I have nowhere to go tonight. Let me move into your penthouse, just until I can secure a divorce settlement and figure things out. We can pool our resources. We can hire a high-powered lawyer to fight Colin and to destroy Hazel. We can survive this if we stick together." Richard slowly turned his head to look at his favorite daughter. His face was a sickly shade of gray. The deep wrinkles around his eyes seemed to have aged him a decade in the span of a single hour. He did not say a word. He simply looked down at the gold-embossed eviction notice sitting on the table in front of him. Patricia followed his gaze, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find the words to explain their catastrophic reality. I sat perfectly still, watching the exact moment the devastating truth crashed down upon all three of them. Felicity was desperately begging to move into a luxury penthouse that my parents no longer had legal access to. My parents were silently looking to their wealthy golden child for a financial bailout she could no longer provide. They were all completely bankrupt, entirely exposed, and utterly homeless. The toxic parasitic ecosystem they had built to exclude and humiliate me had just collapsed inward, violently crushing them under its own weight. "You did this," Richard bellowed, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw fury and profound disbelief. "You planned this entire spectacle just to humiliate your sister. You manipulated Colin into leaving her. You hacked into their banking systems to fabricate these documents. I always knew you harbored a vindictive streak, but this level of sabotage is purely psychotic. My mother immediately rallied behind him, her initial shock morphing into vicious indignation. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking loudly in the quiet room. "You are a cold-blooded monster, Hazel." Patricia spat, her voice echoing off the expensive wood-paneled walls. "You hired this corporate thug to investigate your own flesh and blood. You dug into Felicity's private life just to destroy her marriage because you have always been bitterly jealous of her happiness and her social standing." I looked at their contorted, angry faces. They were still clinging desperately to the illusion that Felicity was the successful golden child, and I was the bitter outcast plotting from the shadows. The sheer absurdity of their delusion was too much to bear. A sharp, cold laugh escaped my lips, slicing through the heavy tension in the room. The sound was so foreign to them, so completely devoid of the quiet submission they expected from me, that it physically startled them. My laughter echoed against the high ceiling, sharp, unyielding, and entirely devoid of humor. "Jealous," I repeated, shaking my head as my laughter subsided into a clinical smirk. "You genuinely believe I spent a single second of my life investigating Felicity? You think I care enough about her pathetic social climbing to hire a private investigator? You give her far too much credit, Patricia. She is a microscopic footnote in my daily operations." I extended my hand toward Ethan without breaking eye contact with my parents. Ethan smoothly extracted a second thick black folder from his leather briefcase and placed it firmly into my palm. I tossed it onto the center of the table, right next to the discarded red foreclosure notice. The heavy thud made Felicity flinch. "I do not have the time or the inclination to investigate your golden child," I stated, my tone dropping to a dead serious, absolute cadence. "I am the CEO of Vanguard Real Estate Holdings. My firm manages billions of dollars in commercial and residential assets across the country. We do not stock minor social media influencers. Last week, my corporate acquisitions team purchased a massive portfolio of bad debt from First National Bank. It was a standard corporate buyout of highly distressed assets. Vanguard acquires these portfolios for pennies on the dollar and liquidates the collateral to generate immediate profit." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany wood, locking eyes with my father. It just so happened that Felicity's fraudulent loans were bundled into that toxic portfolio. I did not go looking for her debt, Richard. I bought it in bulk along with thousands of other failed accounts. Vanguard owns the promissory note on the downtown condo. Vanguard owns the secondary line of credit she used to fund her fake lifestyle. The color completely drained from Patricia's face. Her arm dropped slowly to her side as the crushing reality of my words penetrated her thick layer of denial. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "I am not a monster trying to ruin her happiness," I continued smoothly, savoring every single syllable. "I am her primary corporate creditor. And as of Monday morning, I am her landlord. And she is being aggressively evicted for chronic non-payment." Richard stared at me, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. He looked down at the black Vanguard folder, then back up at my face. His eyes darted around the luxurious private dining room as he suddenly realized that the power dynamic he had violently enforced for 3 decades was permanently destroyed. The daughter he had deemed a worthless failure was sitting across from him, holding the absolute financial ruin of his favorite child in her manicured hands. "You cannot do this, Hazel," Richard said, his voice losing its booming, authoritative edge, replacing it with a desperate, gravelly rasp. "You are family. You are the CEO. You have the ultimate power to stop the bank. You can unilaterally forgive the debt. You can transfer the property deeds back into her name. You just said your company manages billions of dollars. 600,000 is absolutely nothing to you. It is a rounding error. You can fix this right now." I stared at the man who had watched me struggle to pay for my own college textbooks while he bought my sister a designer sports car. The man who had told me I was not smart enough or polished enough to succeed in the ruthless business world. It is not about the money, Richard, I replied, coldly refusing to call him Dad. It is about the fact that she committed severe federal fraud. If I sign a corporate order forgiving this specific debt, Vanguard becomes legally complicit in her financial crimes. I am not risking my corporation, my executive licenses, or my personal freedom to cover up the fact that your golden child is a careless criminal. Felicity, who had been weeping silently in her chair, suddenly snapped her head up. Her face was a tragic mess, her eyes swollen and heavily bloodshot. She looked at our parents, her voice a pathetic, childish whine. "Make her stop, Mom," Felicity pleaded, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Tell her she has to fix it. Tell her to give me my houses back. I cannot go bankrupt. My followers will find out. My entire brand will be destroyed." Patricia looked frantically between Felicity and me. The high society matriarch was completely out of her depth, drowning in a sea of corporate debt she could not manipulate away. "Hazel, please." Patricia begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whimper. "Do not be so cruel. She is your sister. She made a minor mistake. If you take those properties, she will have absolutely nothing. She will be homeless. Her reputation in the city will be destroyed. We will be ruined. How can you be so utterly heartless?" "Heartless," I echoed, standing up slowly from my chair. My imposing presence dominated the room, casting a long shadow over the dining table. "Heartless is watching your eldest daughter work 3 grueling jobs to afford a tiny studio apartment while you finance luxury European vacations for the youngest. Heartless is telling your daughter she will never amount to anything while praising a sister who steals from her own husband to buy designer clothes. You built this monster, Patricia. You taught her that superficial appearances mattered infinitely more than basic integrity. Now you get a front row seat to watch the consequences of your parenting play out in real time." Ethan closed his briefcase with a sharp, definitive click. The metallic sound echoed loudly in the silent room, making Felicity jump. "Miss Hazel," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the emotional wreckage with absolute, unwavering professionalism, "we have an executive board meeting scheduled in exactly 20 minutes. The car is waiting outside." I nodded, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket. I looked down at my family one last time. They looked incredibly small, broken, and entirely pathetic. The grand illusion of their wealth and superiority had been violently shattered, leaving behind nothing but toxic debt and impending legal disasters. "Enjoy the rest of your dinner," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sympathy. "The bill has already been settled. Consider it my final charitable contribution to this family." I turned and walked confidently toward the heavy oak door, Ethan following closely behind me. Before I could reach the brass handle, the door suddenly swung inward. Colin stood in the hallway, his face ashen, his chest heaving, as if he had just sprinted up several flights of stairs. He had not left the restaurant. He had been standing in the corridor, furiously navigating the financial fallout on his phone. Colin looked directly at me, completely ignoring his weeping wife and my stunned, paralyzed parents. He stepped into the room, holding his phone tightly, his knuckles stark white. "Hazel," Colin said, his voice shaking, but laced with a sudden, terrifying realization. "I just checked my secure banking portal. The joint accounts are completely drained, but there is a pending transaction from yesterday afternoon. A massive, unauthorized wire transfer." He turned his furious, burning gaze toward Felicity, who instantly shrank back into her chair, crossing her arms over her face to hide from him. "What about the suburban estate we are living in right now?" Colin roared, his voice booming off the walls. "You told me you paid cash for it. You swore to me you used the inheritance money your parents gave you to buy it outright. If the downtown condo was heavily mortgaged and our joint accounts are completely empty, where did you get the cash to close on the estate?" I stopped walking. I turned slowly back toward the table, tapping my index finger thoughtfully against the polished wood. I looked at Colin, observing the utter panic in his eyes, then looked down at Felicity, who was now shaking uncontrollably. "That is an excellent question, Colin," I said, a dark, satisfied smile spreading slowly across my face. "I think it is time we discuss the final property in Vanguard's newly acquired portfolio." I reached out my hand, And Ethan, without needing a single verbal command, placed the third and final file into my open palm. It was a thick, black, leather-bound dossier. I tossed it onto the center of the table, where it landed with a heavy, commanding thud right next to Colin's clenched fists. "Open it, Colin," I instructed, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. Since my sister and our parents seemed to have developed a sudden convenient case of amnesia regarding their real estate transactions, I will let the official bank records speak for themselves. Colin snatched the black folder, his breathing shallow and rapid. He flipped open the cover, and his eyes immediately locked onto the bold text at the top of the first page. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He swayed slightly on his feet, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table just to keep himself upright. "This is a jumbo mortgage," Colin whispered, his voice hollow and trembling, "for $4.2 million. He slowly lifted his head and stared at Felicity with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "You swore to me your parents paid cash for this house as an early anniversary gift. You sat in our living room, looked me dead in the eyes, and said the deed was free and clear. You told me we only had to pay the property taxes." Felicity was hyperventilating now, her hands clawing at the expensive silk of her ruined dress. "Colin, please," she sobbed, rocking back and forth in her chair. "We wanted a nice home. We needed the space for entertaining. Mom said it was a safe investment." "An investment," I cut in, my voice sharp as a razor blade. "Let us talk about investments, Patricia. Let us talk about how a failed businessman with a string of bankruptcies and a woman who has not worked a single day in her adult life managed to secure a $4 million mortgage from a Tier 1 financial institution." Colin looked up from the documents, his bank manager instincts finally overriding his panic. "Your credit scores are absolute garbage," he said, pointing a shaking finger at Richard. "Both of you have terrible credit histories. I saw the background checks when I married Felicity. No underwriter in the entire country would approve a $4 million loan for you without a heavily vetted guarantor." "Exactly, Colin." I smiled a cold, lethal smile that offered absolutely no mercy. They needed a guarantor. They needed someone with pristine credit, zero debt, and a rapidly expanding corporate income trajectory. They needed someone whose financial profile was flawless enough to blind the bank underwriters to the massive catastrophic risk they were taking. I turned my gaze to my parents. Patricia was visibly shaking, clutching her heavy diamond necklace, as if it could somehow protect her from the truth. Richard was staring at the table, refusing to meet my eyes. 5 years ago, I continued, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous cadence right when I was securing the initial seed funding to launch Vanguard Real Estate Holdings. My parents graciously invited me over for Thanksgiving dinner. It was the first time they had invited me to a holiday meal in years. "Do you remember that, Patricia? You poured me a glass of expensive wine and asked me to help you set up a new online banking portal. You claimed you were terrible with technology and desperately needed my expertise." I stood up slowly, placing my hands flat on the table and leaning toward them. "You needed my laptop. You needed my primary devices to bypass the two-factor authentication on my personal files. While I was in the kitchen baking the holiday pie you specifically requested, Richard went into my bag. He stole my social security number, my personal tax returns, and my highly sensitive corporate identity documents. We were going to pay it back." "Hazel?" Richard rasped, his voice cracking under the weight of his exposed crimes. "It was just a temporary signature. We were going to refinance the house in a few years and take your name off the paperwork. We never meant to hurt you." "You forged my signature as the primary guarantor on a $4.2 million estate," I yelled, my voice finally echoing with a decade of suppressed fury. "You stole my identity. You committed federal identity theft and wire fraud. You leveraged my entire future, the company I bled to build my legal standing, everything just to buy your golden child a mansion she could not afford." Colin stumbled backward, hitting the wall behind him. "Oh my God," he gasped, clutching his chest. "Identity theft. You used my wife to commit federal crimes against her own sister. I am a bank director and my in-laws are a criminal syndicate." Patricia slammed her hands on the table, tears of vicious indignation streaming down her face. "How can you be so selfish?" Hazel, she shrieked, her delusion returning in full force. You have so much money. You have an entire corporation. Felicity needed a house to raise a family and maintain our social standing. You were hoarding your wealth while your own sister struggled. We only borrowed your name. You are a cold-blooded monster for investigating your own flesh and blood just to ruin her happiness. I did not investigate anything, Patricia, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. When Vanguard bought the distressed debt portfolio from your lender, my automated compliance software flagged a massive anomaly. A delinquent $4 million mortgage attached directly to the CEO's Social Security number. Imagine my absolute surprise when my own corporate security team informed me I was on the hook for a suburban estate I had never stepped foot in. I walked around the table until I was standing directly behind Felicity. You thought because I kept my head down and built my empire in silence that I would never find out. You assumed you could default on the loan and the bank would quietly seize my assets to cover your negligence. You actively planned to bankrupt me to save yourselves. Ethan stepped forward, his tablet glowing in the dim light. Because the mortgage was obtained through documented identity fraud, Miss Hazel is not legally liable for the debt, Ethan stated clearly. However, the bank has authorized Vanguard to seize the physical asset immediately. Furthermore, we have forwarded all forged documents to the federal authorities. You are going to prison, Richard, I said, staring down at the man who had despised me my entire life. And Felicity, you are losing the condo, the mansion, and the marriage. You played a dangerous game with my life, and now you have lost everything. I watched the utter devastation wash over their faces as the reality of their situation fully materialized. You actually believed your little identity theft scheme went unnoticed? I asked, my voice echoing with pure mockery. You genuinely thought I was still that helpless outcast, too ignorant to monitor her own financial footprint. I discovered your massive fraudulent loan exactly 3 years ago. Richard jerked his head up, his eyes wide with terror. 3 years, he choked out, gripping the edge of the table. His knuckles turned stark white against the dark wood. If you knew 3 years ago, why did you not call the authorities? Why did you not report the fraud immediately to the police and have the loan voided? Because throwing you in a federal penitentiary right away would have been far too merciful, I replied, leaning back in my chair and studying him with clinical detachment. A quick arrest would have provided you with 3 meals a day, a roof over your head, and the ability to play the victim to your country club friends. It would not have stripped away the one thing you actually value above all else. Your precious high society image, your unearned wealth. I wanted you to feel the exact same profound helplessness you forced upon me for my entire childhood. I wanted you to build your entire existence on a foundation of sand so I could watch it wash away. I turned my attention to Patricia, who was silently weeping into a linen napkin, her diamond rings catching the ambient light. She looked entirely pathetic, stripped of her usual arrogance. When my corporate security team flagged a $4 million liability illegally attached to my Social Security number during a routine compliance audit, I had a choice. I could have frozen my credit and sent the FBI to your doorstep that very night. Instead, I deployed Vanguard's capital to orchestrate a much more fitting consequence. I instructed Ethan to open the final section of the Black Dossier. He smoothly extracted a thick stack of legal contracts bound with a heavy brass clip and slid them across the table. They landed right in front of Richard with a heavy thud. You see, Richard, banks are notoriously eager to offload high-risk jumbo mortgages, I explained, tracing the edge of my water glass. Especially ones secured by borrowers with phantom income. I did not just wait for your debt to fail, I actively purchased it. I set up a blind shell company registered in Delaware called Zenith Financial. 3 years ago, Zenith Financial approached your original lender and bought the paper on Felicity's suburban estate at a massive premium. I became your invisible landlord. I owned the roof over your golden child's head from the very beginning. Colin was staring at me, his mouth slightly open. He was a bank manager. He knew exactly where this was going, and the sheer calculation of it left him breathless. You refinanced them, Colin whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of professional awe and personal dread. You are the private equity firm that offered them that aggressive refinancing package 2 years ago. Give the man a prize, I said, offering Colin a sharp, approving nod. Zenith Financial reached out to Richard with a seemingly miraculous offer, a comprehensive debt restructuring plan with a deceptively low initial interest rate. It was bait carefully designed for a man drowning in secret debt and desperate to maintain appearances. And you, Richard, were arrogant and desperate enough to swallow it whole without ever having a competent corporate lawyer review the fine print. You thought you had outsmarted the system once again. Richard's face turned a sickly shade of gray. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch the bound contracts. What fine print, he demanded, his voice shaking violently. What did you do? The clauses I personally drafted, I replied, my tone dropping into a lethal calm. The contract you so eagerly signed contained extreme penalty triggers. It included a strict cross-default provision, meaning if Felicity defaulted on her downtown condo or her credit cards, it automatically triggered a total default on the suburban estate. It included an aggressive acceleration clause giving the lender the immediate right to demand the entire $4 million balance in full the second a single payment was 30 days late. And most importantly, it contained an absolute waiver of the right to cure. You surrendered your property rights the moment you signed your name. Felicity let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling manicured hands. We missed the payment last month, she sobbed, looking frantically at Richard. You told me you were handling it, Dad. You said your business account was just waiting on a receivable to clear. You told me the grace period would protect us. You promised me we were safe. Grace periods are for standard residential mortgages, I stated sharply, cutting off her pathetic tears. You signed a highly leveraged commercial-grade hard money contract. There is no grace period in the world of high finance. You missed the payment by exactly 31 days. At midnight last night, the trap officially snapped shut. Zenith Financial exercised the acceleration clause. The entire $4 million balance is now due immediately. And since we all know you do not have $4 million, Vanguard has legally seized the deed in lieu of foreclosure. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the polished floorboards. I loomed over the table, radiating the authority they had always denied I possessed. You do not own the estate. You do not own the condo. You do not own the luxury cars that were used as collateral for your secondary credit lines. You are completely and utterly bankrupt. Every asset you claimed as your own belongs to me. Patricia let out a guttural, agonizing wail, clutching her chest, as if she had been physically struck. You cannot leave us with nothing. Hazel, she cried, her heavy makeup running in dark, jagged streaks down her panicked face. Where are we supposed to go? Where is Felicity supposed to live? You have billions of dollars. You can give us the house. You are our daughter. You have to give it back. I have to do absolutely nothing, I countered, my voice ringing with absolute finality, striking the room like a gavel. You stole my identity to fund a fake life of luxury for your favorite child. You treated me like dirt my entire life, while secretly using my pristine credit to finance your country club facade. I took the power you tried to steal from me, and I used it to legally repossess everything you value. The official eviction notices were posted on the wrought iron gates of the suburban estate exactly an hour ago. My private security teams are currently changing the locks on the downtown condo and packing your designer clothes into garbage bags. I looked at Colin, who was silently backing away from the table, physically distancing himself from the toxic wreckage of my family. Colin, I suggest you contact your divorce attorney immediately. Felicity is a massive financial liability, and the federal fraud investigation into my stolen identity will officially begin on Monday morning. You do not want your banking license or your pristine reputation caught in the crossfire when the SEC and the FBI come knocking with warrants. Colin nodded vigorously, his eyes wide with a potent mix of fear and intense gratitude. He did not look at Felicity once as he turned and hurried out of the private dining room, practically sprinting down the hallway, eager to escape the sinking ship before he drowned with them. Felicity screamed his name, a desperate, visceral sound, but the heavy oak door simply slammed shut behind him, echoing with brutal finality. She collapsed onto the floor, her expensive designer gown bunching up around her knees, weeping hysterically into her hands. The golden child was entirely broken, her fabricated world reduced to ash. Patricia fell to her knees beside her, trying fruitlessly to comfort the daughter who was now officially a homeless federal suspect. Richard remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the black Vanguard folder that detailed his complete and total destruction. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow red-rimmed and utterly defeated. "You destroyed us," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his wife and daughter sobbing on the floor. "No, Richard?" I said, adjusting my tailored suit jacket and turning toward the exit, my posture perfect, my conscience entirely clear. "I simply stopped paying for the illusion." "You destroyed yourselves." "I simply stopped paying for the illusion." "You destroyed yourselves." The profound silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. It was the sound of a 30-year dynasty built on arrogance and stolen funds completely imploding. Richard sat paralyzed, his mouth hanging open, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic jerks. He looked like a man who had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness and given exactly 5 minutes to live. Patricia, however, was not ready to surrender her crown. Decades of country club conditioning and narcissistic delusion compelled her to claw desperately for a way out. She wiped her smeared mascara with the back of her trembling hand and pushed herself up from the floor, using the edge of the table for support. She lifted her chin, attempting to summon the haughty matriarch persona she had wielded against me since childhood. "We do not need you," Patricia spat, her voice shaking violently, but laced with venom. "We do not need your corporate blood money, Hazel. We will simply sell the penthouse. It is prime real estate in the city center. It is worth at least $8 million on the current market. We will liquidate our primary residence, pay off this ridiculous debt, and we will never speak to you again. You are dead to us." I stopped walking. I turned slowly, letting my eyes travel over her ruined appearance. A genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. "The penthouse," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue. "You genuinely believe you still own the penthouse, Patricia?" Her eyes widened in sudden panic. She snapped her head toward Richard, who had suddenly squeezed his eyes shut and buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, agonizing groan. "Did he not tell you?" I asked, feigning mild surprise. "Richard, you really should communicate better with your wife about your shared financial liabilities." I walked slowly back to the table and tapped the thick black dossier Ethan had provided. "You see, Patricia, your husband's manufacturing business has been hemorrhaging cash for the last 7 years. He was desperate to maintain the illusion of success, so he started quietly taking out massive equity lines of credit against the penthouse. He drained the equity to pay for your country club dues, to fund your European vacations, to buy Felicity her luxury vehicles, and to throw her a $500,000 wedding. He treated your home like a limitless ATM to finance your fake aristocratic lifestyle." Patricia stared at Richard, her face contorting with a mix of betrayal and horror. "Richard," she gasped, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me we still have our home." Richard did not answer. He just kept his face buried in his hands, shaking his head back and forth in silent, devastating defeat. "It gets worse, Patricia," I continued, refusing to give them a single second to breathe. When Richard and Felicity approached Zenith Financial to restructure their massive suburban estate loan, their credit was already completely destroyed. To secure that $4 million hard money loan, the underwriters required aggressive collateral. Richard signed a cross-collateralization agreement. He pledged the penthouse as the ultimate security blanket for Felicity's mansion. I leaned in close so Patricia could hear every single syllable with crystal clarity. When Felicity defaulted on her estate, she automatically triggered a hard default on the penthouse. The properties are financially tethered together. Vanguard seized the deed to the suburban estate at midnight. And exactly 1 minute later, Vanguard seized the deed to your luxury penthouse. You do not have a primary residence to sell, Patricia. My private corporate security teams are currently standing in the lobby of your high-rise, coordinating with the building concierges to box up your designer shoes, your crystal vases, and your expensive artwork. You are being evicted tonight. Patricia let out a sound that barely registered as human. It was a high-pitched, breathless shriek. Her legs gave out completely, and she collapsed back onto the polished floorboards, landing in a heap of expensive silk and diamond jewelry right next to her golden child. Let us review the final accounting I announced, projecting my voice so it commanded the entire room. $4 million for the suburban estate, $2 million for the downtown condo, $8 million in leveraged debt against the penthouse, and another $500,000 in unsecured business loans and maxed-out emergency credit cards. Your total outstanding debt to Vanguard Real Estate Holdings is exactly $14.5 million. You have zero assets. You have zero equity. Every single thing you thought you owned officially belongs to me. You are completely, entirely, and officially bankrupt. The sheer magnitude of the number hung in the air, pressing down on them like a physical weight. The ecosystem of toxic elitism they had built to exclude and humiliate me was entirely eradicated. They were sitting on the floor of a private dining room that they could no longer afford, stripped of their assets, their dignity, and their future. They were destitute. Suddenly, the heavy oak door creaked loudly. The sound cut through the weeping and sobbing, echoing sharply in the tense room. Colin was standing in the doorway. He had rushed out in a blind panic earlier, but now he marched back inside his face, a mask of cold, hard resolve. He walked straight toward the table, keeping his eyes fixed on the empty chair where he had been sitting. He grabbed his leather briefcase and snatched his car keys off the mahogany wood. Felicity looked up, her face a tragic, swollen mess. She scrambled to her knees, reaching her trembling arms out toward him, like a drowning woman reaching for a life raft. "Colin," she gasped, her voice a pathetic, broken whine. "Colin, please do not leave me. We can fix this. My parents can borrow money from Uncle Arthur. I will sell my bags. We can start over. Please, I love you." Colin stopped. He looked down at the woman he had married, the woman who had secretly forged his name and destroyed his pristine financial identity. He did not say a word. He simply raised his left hand and grabbed the heavy platinum wedding band circling his ring finger. With a violent, aggressive yank, he pulled the ring off. He threw it directly at the table. The heavy platinum band hit the polished mahogany with a sharp, loud crack. It spun wildly for a few seconds before settling dead center right on top of the foreclosure documents. "I will not bury my career with a family of fraudsters." Colin spat, his voice dripping with absolute unfiltered disgust. He turned on his heel and marched toward the exit. Felicity lunged forward with a desperate, agonizing scream, grabbing his ankle and letting her dead weight drag against his leg. Colin did not even pause. He forcefully kicked his leg free, shaking her off like a parasite. He walked out the door and slammed it shut behind him, sealing her fate. The heavy oak door shuddered in its frame from the force of Colin's exit, leaving a deafening silence in his wake. Felicity remained sprawled on the polished hardwood floor, staring blankly at the brass door handle. The reality of her absolute destruction finally short-circuited her mind. She had lost her wealthy husband. She had lost her multi-million-dollar suburban estate. She had lost her downtown condo. Her meticulously curated social media empire was about to be exposed as a massive federal fraud. She let out a visceral, blood-curdling shriek that tore through her throat. It was not a cry of sadness, but the raw, animalistic sound of an ego being crushed into dust. She began tearing at her own hair, ripping the elaborate updo to shreds. Her expensive designer gown was twisted and stained with her own tears and smeared makeup. Patricia rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside her golden child. She reached out her diamond-clad hands to soothe her, but Felicity violently slapped her mother away. "Do not touch me!" Felicity shrieked, her face contorted with pure venom. "This is your fault. You told me I had to have the biggest house. You told me I had to keep up with the country club wives. You made me forge those documents so you could brag to your friends. Now I am going to federal prison and my husband just left me. I have no money. I have no credit." Colin froze the joint accounts and locked me out. "I cannot even afford to hire a defense attorney. You ruined my entire life." Felicity pounded her fists against the floorboards, throwing a violent temper tantrum like a spoiled toddler. Patricia recoiled as if she had been physically struck. She sat back on her heels looking at the wretched, hysterical mess that was once her perfect daughter. Richard remained entirely frozen by the table. His chest heaved as his eyes darted from the red foreclosure notice to the platinum wedding ring Colin had abandoned on top of it. The illusion was dead. Zenith Financial Vanguard Real Estate Holdings. The cross-collateralized default. Every single financial maneuver he thought made him a genius had simply been the precise mechanism of his own execution. The massive fraudulent loans were entirely under his signature and Felicity's. The cross-collateralization meant the bank would take everything to satisfy the debt. And because of the criminal nature of the applications, bankruptcy protection would likely be denied. They would be stripped of every asset and left with massive federal restitution payments. The pristine upper-class reputation Richard had fiercely protected was dead. He would be paraded through the local news as a common white-collar thief. He was legally, financially, and socially annihilated. I stood a few feet away, watching them self-destruct with complete emotional detachment. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket, signaling to Ethan that we were ready to depart. The show was over. My presence here was no longer required. But as I took my first step toward the exit, Richard suddenly moved. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had spent 30 years looking down his nose at me, telling me I was a worthless disappointment, suddenly shattered. "Wait!" Richard gasped, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, reedy plea. "Hazel, wait, please!" He scrambled out of his chair. His legs gave out beneath him and he crashed hard onto his knees. The sickening thud of his kneecaps hitting the solid wood floor echoed through the private dining room. The sound made my stomach turn, but I did not blink. Richard did not try to stand back up. Instead, he shuffled forward on his knees, dragging himself across the floor toward me. The man who had demanded total submission from everyone around him was now crawling like a pathetic, broken animal. He reached out with his trembling, sweaty hands and grabbed the fabric of my skirt, holding on to me as if I were the edge of a cliff and he was dangling over the abyss. "Hazel, you cannot leave," he begged, looking up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. His face was slick with sweat and tears. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot take the penthouse. Where will your mother and I live? We will be on the street. I am a respected businessman. If my colleagues find out I am bankrupt, I will be ruined. You have to stop Vanguard. You have to call your executives right now and tell them to halt the evictions. Please, Hazel, I am begging you." I looked down at the hands gripping my clothes. I felt a surge of absolute revulsion. "Remove your hands from me," I ordered, my voice dropping to a glacial whisper. Richard only gripped the fabric tighter, his knuckles turning white. "No, you have to listen to me," he cried out, fresh tears spilling down his wrinkled cheeks. "We are family, Hazel. We are your parents. Blood is thicker than water. You cannot put your own flesh and blood out on the street. We made mistakes, yes, but we did it to protect the family image. We did it for all of us. You have billions of dollars. You can absorb this loss. You can wipe the slate clean. Just sign the papers and give us back our homes. I will do anything. I will work for you. I will pay you back every single cent. Just do not destroy us. You are my daughter. A daughter does not do this to her father. You are supposed to honor your parents. I gave you life. You owe me this salvation." Hearing her husband groveling, Patricia snapped out of her paralyzed state. The wealthy socialite realized that her entire identity was about to be packed into garbage bags by corporate security teams. She abandoned her crying golden child and crawled across the floor to join Richard. Patricia threw herself at my feet, grabbing my other leg. Her heavy diamond bracelets dug painfully into my shin, but she did not care. "She is right, Hazel," Patricia sobbed. Her face completely ruined, her pride entirely evaporated. "We are your family. I gave birth to you. You owe us. You cannot let them take my things. All my jewelry, all my art, my entire life is in that penthouse. Please, Hazel, I will be a good mother. I will treat you better. I will tell everyone at the country club how successful you are. I will make you the golden child. Just please do not take my house. Please call off your men." I stared down at the two pathetic figures clinging to my legs. These were the people who had locked me out of the house when I could not pay rent during my college years. These were the people who had laughed in my face when I showed them my first business plan, telling me I lacked the intellect to run a lemonade stand, let alone a corporation. These were the people who had stolen my personal identity to finance a mansion for a sister who actively bullied me. Now they were weeping on the floor of a restaurant, begging for a crumb of the massive financial empire I had built entirely without them. The sheer hypocrisy of their pleas was nauseating. They did not love me. They did not regret their actions. They only regretted that they had targeted the wrong daughter and that their victim had evolved into their executioner. I stepped back, pulling the hem of my skirt free from Richard's sweaty, desperate grasp, with a sharp, violent motion. The sheer physical contact with him made my skin crawl, radiating a toxic energy I had spent years learning to block out. I smoothed the fabric with deliberate, slow precision, refusing to even look at him until I was perfectly composed. The power dynamic in the room had irreversibly shifted, and every second of silence stretched their agony. "Hazel, please," Richard croaked, reaching out again, his hands trembling in the empty air. "We are elite. We belong in that penthouse. You cannot leave us like this. We will lose all our friends. We will be ostracized." I tilted my head, looking down at him as if he were an interesting but repulsive specimen under a microscope. "Elite." I repeated the word, tasting like pure acidic venom on my tongue. "I remember that word, Richard. I remember you using it very specifically the day I came to you for a cosigner on my first tiny apartment lease. I was 19, working 3 jobs, exhausted and barely scraping by. Do you remember what you told me that day while sitting in your leather armchair swirling your expensive imported scotch?" Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room in a blind panic. "I was trying to teach you independence," he stammered, a pathetic, flimsy attempt to rewrite his own history of cruelty. "No," I snapped, my voice slicing through his lies like a surgical scalpel. "You told me I was just a renter. You told me I lacked the mindset of the elite. You said people like me were destined to scrape the bottom of the barrel, while people like you shaped the world. You refused to sign a simple piece of paper to keep me off the streets, because you claimed I would drag your prestigious name into the mud. You looked at your own teenage daughter and decided she was a peasant unworthy of your elite protection." Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sob, pressing her face against the floorboards. "Hazel," she cried out, her voice muffled by the wood. "We were wrong. We admit it. We were blind and foolish. But we are your parents. We gave you everything. You have to save us. You cannot just abandon your family." "I do not have to do anything, Patricia," I stated coldly, staring at her shaking shoulders. "The time for parental loyalty expired the moment you stole my identity to fund your pathetic country club charade. Let me throw your own philosophy right back at you. I am just a renter lacking the mindset of the elite. You two are the upper-class visionaries. Elite people like you can solve this yourselves." Richard let out a strangled gasp, his chest heaving as the absolute finality of my words crashed down upon him. He knew there was no escaping this. The safety net he assumed he could manipulate the daughter he thought he could abuse into submission was completely gone. Ethan stepped forward right on cue, holding his glowing tablet. "The process is complete. Miss Hazel," he announced, his voice crisp and professional, completely ignoring the 2 weeping figures on the floor. "The security teams have successfully secured the perimeter of the downtown penthouse. All access fobs have been deactivated, and the physical key slots have been changed. The building concierge has been notified of the change in ownership and the eviction protocol. Furthermore, the locks on the suburban estate have been drilled and replaced. We have teams standing by to enforce the perimeter." "Thank you, Ethan," I said, never taking my eyes off Richard. "Did you hear that, Richard? Your assets are currently being sealed. Everything is gone. Your bespoke tailored suits, your imported luxury cars, the expensive modern art you bought simply to impress your golf buddies, all of it is locked away behind corporate steel and private security. If you try to enter the lobby of either building tonight, you will be arrested for trespassing on Vanguard property." Felicity, who had been weeping silently in the corner, suddenly let out a fresh wave of agonizing screams. Her mind was finally grasping the absolute reality that she was no longer a wealthy housewife, but a destitute criminal suspect abandoned by her husband. She rocked back and forth, hugging her knees, burying her face in her ruined dress, a portrait of total mental collapse. "You are a monster!" Patricia shrieked, her tone shifting abruptly from begging back to her true malicious nature. "You are a cold-blooded, calculating sociopath. We raised you. We put food in your mouth. And you plotted our destruction for 3 years in secret. You are evil." "I am not the one who committed federal wire fraud, Patricia," I replied, my tone completely unbothered by her pathetic insults. "I am just a private equity investor protecting my corporate assets. The real monster here is the criminal who used his own daughter to bypass a bank underwriter. Speaking of which, Ethan, please inform the legal department to finalize the packet." "Already done," Ethan replied, tapping the screen with sharp, precise movements. The entire dossier containing the forged signatures, the fake income declarations, the false tax returns, and the fraudulent identity transfer has been compiled and digitized into a secure file. I looked down at Richard, watching the last remaining shred of color drain from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. Tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, my legal team is hand-delivering that entire dossier directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They will also be sending courtesy copies to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service. Bank fraud, identity theft, and wire fraud across state lines are severe federal offenses, Richard. You are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. And Felicity, since her signature is right next to yours on the mortgage applications and the credit lines, she will be joining you in a matching orange jumpsuit. Richard collapsed, completely pressing his forehead against the cold floor. He looked like a deflated balloon, a man completely emptied of his false pride and unearned arrogance. He was weeping openly now, loud, pathetic, gasping sobs that echoed off the high ceilings of the private dining room. Patricia was staring into space, her mouth opening and closing silently, unable to comprehend her new reality. I turned my back on them, feeling nothing but an overwhelming sense of profound peace. The crushing weight I had carried since childhood, the constant feeling of inadequacy, the desperate yearning for their approval, it was all completely gone. They had finally shown me their true colors, and I had painted their reality black. They were no longer my family. They were just a bad investment I had finally liquidated. "Ethan, let us go," I instructed, heading toward the door, my steps light and purposeful. "We have early meetings tomorrow, and I do not want to waste another second of my time breathing the same air as these criminals." "Right behind you, Miss Hazel," Ethan replied, following me with practiced efficiency. I walked out of the restaurant without a single backward glance, the sounds of their weeping fading into the background. I stepped back, pulling my legs free from their sweaty, desperate grasp with a sharp, violent motion. The sheer physical contact with them made my skin crawl, radiating a toxic energy I had spent years learning to block out. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored trousers with deliberate, slow precision, refusing to even look at them until my composure was absolutely perfect. The power dynamic in the room had irreversibly shifted, and every second of silence stretched their agonizing humiliation. Richard let out a broken wheeze, his hands clawing at the empty space where I had just been standing. He looked up at me, his face a grotesque mask of pure terror. "Hazel, please," he croaked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, reedy plea. "We are elite. We belong in that penthouse. You cannot leave us like this. We will lose all our friends. We will be ostracized. You have the power to fix this right now." I tilted my head, looking down at him as if he were an interesting but entirely repulsive specimen under a microscope. "Elite." I repeated the word, tasting like pure acidic venom on my tongue. "I remember that word, Richard. I remember you using it very specifically the day I came to you for a co-signer on my first tiny apartment lease. I was 19, working 3 jobs, exhausted and barely scraping by. Do you remember what you told me that day while sitting in your leather armchair, swirling your expensive imported scotch? Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room in a blind panic. I was trying to teach you independence. He stammered a pathetic, flimsy attempt to rewrite his own history of cruelty. No, I snapped, my voice slicing through his lies like a surgical scalpel. You told me I was just a renter. You told me I lacked the mindset of the elite. You said people like me were destined to scrape the bottom of the barrel while people like you shaped the world. You refused to sign a simple piece of paper to keep me off the streets because you claimed I would drag your prestigious name into the mud. You looked at your own teenage daughter and decided she was a peasant unworthy of your elite protection. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sob, pressing her face against the floorboards. Hazel, she cried out, her voice muffled by the wood. We were wrong. We admit it. We were blind and foolish. But we are your parents. We gave you everything. You have to save us. You cannot just abandon your family. I do not have to do anything, Patricia, I stated coldly, staring at her shaking shoulders. The time for parental loyalty expired the moment you stole my identity to fund your pathetic country club charade. Let me throw your own philosophy right back at you. I am just a renter lacking the mindset of the elite. You two are the upper-class visionaries. Elite people like you can solve this yourselves. Richard let out a strangled gasp, his chest heaving as the absolute finality of my words crashed down upon him. He knew there was no escaping this. The safety net he assumed he could manipulate the daughter he thought he could abuse into submission was completely gone. The psychological blow struck him harder than the financial one. His own arrogance had been forged into the blade currently sitting against his throat. Ethan stepped forward right on cue, holding his glowing tablet. The process is complete. Miss Hazel, he announced, his voice crisp and professional, completely ignoring the weeping figures on the floor. The security teams have successfully secured the perimeter of the downtown penthouse. All access fobs have been deactivated, and the physical key slots have been changed. The building concierge has been notified of the change in ownership and the eviction protocol. Furthermore, the locks on the suburban estate have been drilled and replaced. We have teams standing by to enforce the perimeter. Thank you, Ethan, I said, never taking my eyes off Richard and Patricia. Did you hear that? Your assets are currently being sealed. Everything is gone. Your bespoke, tailored suits, your imported luxury cars, the expensive modern art you bought simply to impress your golf buddies. All of it is locked away behind corporate steel and private security. If you try to enter the lobby of either building tonight, you will be arrested for trespassing on Vanguard property. Patricia scrambled up to her knees, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. My jewelry! She shrieked, her voice breaking. My designer bags, my furs! You cannot seal them away. Those belong to me. I need them. You needed a reality check, Patricia, I replied, my tone completely unbothered by her pathetic insults. And now you have one. Every diamond you wear, every designer bag you flaunt was purchased using my credit. They are proceeds of a crime. Vanguard forensic accountants have already traced every single transaction. Those items will be seized and auctioned off to recover the debt. You do not own a single thread on your back. You are a squatter who has been officially evicted from my property. Felicity, who had been weeping silently in the corner, suddenly let out a fresh wave of agonizing screams. Her mind was finally grasping the absolute reality that she was no longer a wealthy housewife, but a destitute outcast abandoned by her husband. She rocked back and forth, hugging her knees, burying her face in her ruined dress, a portrait of total mental collapse. You are a monster! Patricia yelled, her tone shifting abruptly from begging back to her true malicious nature. You are a cold-blooded, calculating sociopath. We raised you. We put food in your mouth, and you plotted our destruction for 3 years in secret. You are evil. I am not the one who committed federal wire fraud, Patricia, I replied, keeping my posture perfect, my conscience entirely clear. I am just a private equity investor protecting my corporate assets. The real monster here is the criminal who used his own daughter to bypass a bank underwriter. Which brings me to my final point. I walked back to the table and picked up the thick black dossier. I held it up so they could see the heavy brass clips securing the pages together. Ethan, please inform the legal department that the packet is ready for distribution, I commanded. Already done, Ethan replied, tapping the screen with sharp, precise movements. The entire dossier containing the forged signatures, the fake income declarations, the false tax returns, and the fraudulent identity transfer has been compiled and digitized into a secure file. I looked down at Richard, watching the last remaining shred of color drain from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. Tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, my legal team is hand-delivering that entire dossier directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They will not just send a polite summons, Richard. They will send federal agents to wherever you decide to sleep tonight. They will freeze your business accounts. They will seize your passports. They will march you out in handcuffs for the entire city to witness. Bank fraud, identity theft, and wire fraud across state lines are severe federal offenses. You are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. And Felicity, since her signature is right next to yours on the mortgage applications and the credit lines, she will be joining you in a matching orange jumpsuit. Richard collapsed, completely pressing his forehead against the cold floor. He looked like a deflated balloon, a man completely emptied of his false pride and unearned arrogance. He was weeping openly now, loud, pathetic, gasping sobs that echoed off the high ceilings of the private dining room. Patricia was staring into space, her mouth opening and closing silently, unable to comprehend her new reality. The police were going to come for them. The wealth was gone. The freedom was gone. I turned my back on them, feeling nothing but an overwhelming sense of profound peace. The crushing weight I had carried since childhood, the constant feeling of inadequacy, the desperate yearning for their approval, it was all completely gone. They had finally shown me their true colors, and I had painted their reality black. They were no longer my family. They were just a bad investment I had finally liquidated. Ethan, let us go, I instructed, heading toward the door, my steps light and purposeful. We have early meetings tomorrow, and I do not want to waste another second of my time breathing the same air as these criminals. Right behind you, Miss Hazel, Ethan replied, following me with practiced efficiency. I walked out of the restaurant without a single backward glance, the sounds of their weeping fading into the background. The night air outside was cool and refreshing, carrying the promise of a brilliant, unobstructed future. I had burned their fake elite empire to the ground, and from those ashes I was rising higher than they could ever possibly reach. The night air outside was cool and refreshing, carrying the promise of a brilliant, unobstructed future. I had burned their fake elite empire to the ground, and from those ashes I was rising higher than they could ever possibly reach. The weekend passed in a blur of strategic silence. I knew exactly what was happening inside those two properties. Richard and Patricia were likely scrambling, calling every favor, every lawyer, every wealthy friend, trying to stop the inevitable. But federal bank fraud tied to private equity cross-collateralization is a steel trap. By Monday morning, the trap snapped shut. Monday arrived with crisp, unfeeling efficiency. At precisely 8 o'clock, the heavy machinery of the county sheriff department and the federal justice system began to move. There were no dramatic movie scenes or prolonged courtroom monologues. There was only the cold, hard reality of the law executing its absolute mandate. I sat in my downtown office watching the live security feed Ethan had routed to my main monitor. 2 marked county sheriff cruisers and 3 black Vanguard security SUVs pulled up to the curb of Richard and Patricia's luxury high-rise. 4 uniformed deputies stepped out, accompanied by Vanguard's lead asset recovery agent. They bypassed the concierge, heading straight for the private elevator. Up in the penthouse, Richard and Patricia were nursing the ultimate hangover of panic. When the heavy knock echoed through their massive double doors, Richard opened it, looking uncharacteristically disheveled in his expensive silk robe. The lead deputy did not mince words. He held up a clipboard displaying the court-ordered eviction notice and the asset seizure mandate. Richard, Vanguard Real Estate Holdings, has taken legal possession of this property, he stated, his voice booming in the quiet hallway. You have exactly 15 minutes to vacate the premises. Richard tried to argue, putting his hands up in a placating gesture. He attempted to use his elite businessman tone, insisting there was a misunderstanding and demanding to call his lawyers. The deputy remained completely impassive. He unclipped his handcuffs, letting the heavy metal clink loudly, signaling that any resistance would result in an immediate physical arrest for trespassing and obstruction of justice. Patricia rushed into the grand foyer, screaming about her constitutional rights and her irreplaceable belongings. A female deputy handed Patricia a heavy-duty black plastic garbage bag. "You may take one bag of essential clothing and basic toiletries," the deputy instructed sharply. "Everything else inside these walls is now the property of the seized estate pending the federal fraud investigation. If you attempt to conceal or remove any valuables, you will be charged with theft of corporate assets." The visual of Patricia clutching a cheap black trash bag was pure poetic justice. The woman who had spent decades dripping in diamonds and judging anyone wearing off-the-rack clothing was now frantically running into her massive walk-in closet. She tried to slip a velvet jewelry box containing her favorite diamond necklace into the plastic bag, but the asset recovery agent was right behind her. He snatched the box right out of her shaking hands. He coldly informed her that all high-value assets, jewelry artwork, and designer accessories were cross-collateralized against the fraudulent loans. They were allowed nothing but the absolute bare minimum to survive on the street. Across town in the upscale suburban gated community, a nearly identical scene was playing out at Felicity's sprawling estate. Ethan tapped his tablet, bringing up the secondary feed on my screen. Felicity was putting on a spectacular show of resistance. She had thrown herself onto the imported marble floor of her grand foyer, screaming at the deputies that she was an innocent victim. She demanded to call her husband, completely ignoring the brutal fact that Colin had frozen their accounts, filed for emergency divorce, and blocked her number the very moment the federal scandal broke. The deputies were entirely unmoved by her practiced influencer hysterics. They had dealt with spoiled adults facing reality 1,000 times before. They gave her the same strict 15-minute window and the same black garbage bags. The pristine social media star, who had curated a fake life of absolute aesthetic perfection, was forced to stuff yoga pants and basic shirts into a trash bag. When the time was up, she was marched out of her custom-ironed front doors, looking like a raving lunatic, with smeared mascara and a garbage bag slung over her expensive silk pajamas. Her wealthy suburban neighbors stood on their perfectly manicured lawns, watching in stunned silence as the local Golden Girl was legally thrown to the curb like common refuse. Back at the downtown high-rise, Richard and Patricia's 15 minutes had officially expired. The deputies escorted them out of the penthouse and marched them into the elevator. This was the moment of total social annihilation I had orchestrated. The lobby of their prestigious building was always bustling at 8:30 in the morning, with wealthy executives, socialites, and corporate power players heading out for their day. As the elevator doors chimed open, Richard and Patricia stepped into the grand marble lobby, heavily flanked by uniformed law enforcement. Patricia attempted to hide her face behind her messy, unstyled hair, but it was completely useless. An older woman dripping in Chanel, who I recognized as the president of Patricia's elite country club, stopped dead in her tracks. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth in utter shock. A group of Richard's golf buddies standing near the valet stand lowered their artisan coffee cups, staring in absolute disgust. Richard tried to offer them a weak nod, a pathetic, desperate attempt to save face and project control. The men simply turned their backs on him, walking away quickly, as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. In the elite circles, they worshipped weakness, and poverty were unforgivable sins. But being exposed as a common fraudster was the ultimate death sentence. Being escorted out by the police with your entire life stuffed into a garbage bag meant absolute, irreversible social execution. The deputies marched them through the revolving glass doors and out onto the busy downtown sidewalk. They were not offered a ride. The federal agents had already seized their luxury imported vehicles from the underground garage. Richard and Patricia stood on the cold concrete, shivering in the morning air, holding their garbage bags. They had nowhere to go. Their elite credit cards were frozen. Their bank accounts were locked down by federal mandate due to the ongoing wire fraud investigation. The glittering empire they had built entirely on my stolen identity was completely gone. I watched the screen as they began to walk aimlessly down the sidewalk, looking over their shoulders at the building they used to rule. It was a beautiful, flawless sight. The system they thought they were smart enough to manipulate had chewed them up and spit them out onto the pavement. Ethan poured me a fresh cup of coffee, setting it gently on my polished desk. "Everything is proceeding perfectly, Miss Hazel," he reported. "The FBI agents are waiting for them 2 blocks away. They let the sheriffs handle the property eviction first to ensure all physical assets were secured without a standoff. The criminal arrests will happen within the hour." I took a slow sip of the hot coffee, savoring the rich, robust flavor. It was going to be a very productive Monday. Within the hour, the breaking news alerts began flashing across my secondary monitor. Local news helicopters had captured the exact moment federal agents descended on Richard and Patricia as they wandered aimlessly near the financial district. The footage was striking and deeply satisfying. Richard was forcefully pressed against the hood of an unmarked black sedan as cold steel handcuffs snapped sharply around his wrists. Patricia was shrieking in horror, her voice echoing down the avenue as a female agent read her Miranda rights right there on the busy downtown sidewalk. Their pathetic garbage bags filled with absolute basic necessities were unceremoniously tossed into the trunk of a federal vehicle. The elite couple was shoved into the back of a squad car, their faces plastered across every major news network in the state. Across town, Felicity faced an equally brutal reality check. She was arrested in the driveway of her foreclosed suburban estate, mascara running down her face as she screamed for her husband to save her. But Colin was already 10 steps ahead of the scandal. By Tuesday morning, Colin and his aggressive legal team officially filed for a highly publicized divorce. The documents were a masterpiece of ruthless legal severing. He cited irreconcilable differences and criminal fraud, completely isolating his own clean assets from her toxic legal mess. A process server handed Felicity the divorce papers right outside the federal courthouse moments after she posted bail. Colin showed absolutely no mercy. He immediately canceled her premium health insurance, terminated her phone plan, and cut off every single line of credit she had ever touched. The wealthy tech executive completely erased her from his life with surgical precision. Felicity was left entirely alone, holding a frozen bank account, a pending federal indictment, and an Instagram following that was rapidly turning her spectacular downfall into a viral internet joke. Her sponsors dropped her within hours, issuing public statements distancing themselves from her criminal actions. The influencer empire she valued above human decency dissolved into thin air. The justice system moved with crushing, terrifying speed against them. Faced with a mountain of undeniable digital evidence provided by Vanguard legal teams, Richard and Patricia quickly realized going to trial would mean dying in a federal penitentiary. Their public defender, an overworked attorney who had absolutely no patience for their elitist complaints, forced them to face reality. To avoid physical jail time, they had to take a brutal, unconditional plea deal. In a sterile courtroom stripped of all their designer clothing, they stood before a federal judge and admitted full guilt to wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. The judge looked down at them with visible disgust, calling their actions against their own daughter reprehensible and cowardly. They received heavy, suspended sentences and a decade of strict federal probation. The court mandated absolute financial restitution, stripping them of any hidden offshore pennies they might have tried to conceal. The IRS seized their remaining retirement accounts to cover the massive penalties. They avoided a physical jail cell, but the alternative was a life sentence of crushing, inescapable poverty. Felicity received an identical suspended sentence, leaving her a convicted felon with a ruined reputation and zero job prospects. 6 months later, the transition from the penthouse to the pavement was complete. The prestigious Wilson family name was entirely dead and buried. Ethan kept tabs on their whereabouts simply to ensure our corporate restraining orders were never violated. He placed a recent surveillance report on my desk, detailing their new permanent residence. With zero credit, massive debt, and felony records, they had been forced to relocate to Sunny Meadows. It was a severely run-down trailer park located 40 miles outside the city limits, far away from the elite circles they used to dominate. It was a bleak, desolate stretch of gravel lots, rusted metal homes, and sagging chain-link fences. The report included high-resolution photographs, and the visual contrast was jarring. Patricia, a woman who used to throw spectacular temper tantrums if the imported marble in her foyer was not polished to a mirror shine, was now living in a cramped, single-wide trailer with peeling aluminum siding. The photographs showed her attempting to sweep a cracked concrete patio, wearing faded sweatpants and a cheap, oversized shirt. Her perfectly dyed hair had grown out, revealing stark gray roots she could no longer afford to maintain at a salon. She looked frail and exhausted, entirely stripped of the arrogant, glowing superiority that stolen money had provided her. The report noted that she refused to speak to any of her neighbors, still clinging to a pathetic delusion that she was somehow better than the people living beside her. Richard had deteriorated even further. The former patriarch who demanded total submission and spoke endlessly about the mindset of the elite now spent his days sitting on a rusted folding chair, staring blankly at a dirt driveway. To pay the meager lot rent and afford basic groceries, Richard had secured a minimum wage job working the night shift as a toll booth attendant on the turnpike. He had to wear a cheap polyester uniform and take orders from supervisors half his age. Every time a luxury car drove past his tiny glass booth, it served as a brutal, agonizing reminder of the empire he had lost through his own overwhelming greed. His pride, his massive ego, his entire sense of self-worth had been thoroughly pulverized into dust. Felicity was living with them, crammed into the tiny secondary bedroom of the metal trailer. Stripped of her wealthy husband and her social media validation, she had completely shut down. The surveillance reports indicated she rarely left the cramped trailer, unable to face the reality of working a regular minimum wage job or interacting with people she deemed beneath her. They were all trapped together in a suffocating, poorly ventilated box, drowning in their own toxic resentment. They spent their evenings screaming at each other through the thin walls, blaming one another for their collective downfall. I closed the surveillance file, sliding it across my polished mahogany desk, and handed it back to Ethan. The loop was finally closed. They had built their entire identity on the grand illusion that they were inherently superior to everyone around them. They had treated me like disposable trash simply because I refused to play their shallow, parasitic games. Now they were exactly where they belonged. They were not elite visionaries or upper-class royalty. They were just three broken, bitter people living in a rusted trailer, relying on cheap canned food and strict government supervision to survive. I turned my leather executive chair toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, looking out over the glittering city skyline. Vanguard was expanding, acquiring new commercial assets, and dominating the international market. I had built a legacy based on intellect, strategic planning, and relentless hard work. I had faced their cruelty and turned it into my absolute power, and I had done it entirely without them. The morning sun crested over Lake Michigan, casting a brilliant golden light that flooded my expansive glass office. From the top floor of the Chicago skyscraper, I could see the entire city waking up below me. The sprawling grid of streets, the tiny cars moving like ants, the distant boats on the water, all of it felt like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. I stood up from my desk and walked right up to the reinforced glass, resting my palm against the cool pane. For the first time in my entire 32 years of existence, my mind was completely quiet. There were no lingering doubts whispering in the back of my head. There was no desperate inner child begging to be seen or validated by people who were incapable of love. The suffocating shadow of Richard and Patricia had been permanently eradicated, evaporated by the blazing light of my own success. A soft knock on the heavy oak door broke my reverie. Ethan stepped into the office carrying a single dark blue leather folder. His usual intense corporate demeanor was softened by a rare, genuine smile. He walked across the plush carpet and placed the folder gently on the center of my desk. "This is the final item on the docket for this morning, Miss Hazel," Ethan said, stepping back and clasping his hands behind his back. "The legal department has finalized the charter trust documents and the initial funding transfers. It just requires your official signature to go live." I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk. I opened the heavy leather cover and looked down at the crisp, pristine documents inside. The header at the top of the page read, "The Vanguard Horizon Initiative." It was not a corporate merger or a real estate acquisition. It was a comprehensive, deeply personal endowment fund I had been designing in secret for the past 6 months. I sat down and began reading through the finalized clauses, running my fingers over the elegant typography. The initiative was a massive multi-million-dollar scholarship and housing fund designed specifically for young adults who had been abandoned, disowned, or financially abused by their families. It was structured to provide full university tuition, comprehensive living stipends, and most importantly, guaranteed no co-signer apartment leases for students navigating the world entirely alone. I had instructed my legal team to build a safety net so strong and so expansive that no young woman or man would ever have to experience the terrifying freefall of being thrown out onto the street. I read the specific provision detailing the housing guarantees. Vanguard Real Estate Holdings would permanently reserve 10% of all units in our newly developed residential complexes, specifically for these students. They would never have to beg a toxic parent to sign a lease. They would never have to hear a smug, arrogant voice tell them they were just renters destined for the bottom of the barrel. They would be given the keys to their own independence handed to them with absolute respect and zero conditional strings attached. I picked up my gold fountain pen, feeling the solid weight of it in my hand. I thought about the 19-year-old girl who used to cry herself to sleep in a freezing, cramped dorm room, terrified of eviction and suffocated by the belief that she was unworthy of love. I thought about the cruel, dismissive laughter that used to echo through Richard and Patricia's grand dining room whenever I dared to dream of a better life. I pressed the gold nib to the thick paper and signed my name with a smooth, sweeping flourish. With that single stroke of ink, the Vanguard Horizon Initiative was born. The wealth that Richard and Patricia had tried to steal, the empire they had tried to crush, was now being weaponized to protect the exact kind of vulnerable people they used to despise. I handed the signed folder back to Ethan. "Execute the transfers immediately, Ethan," I instructed, my voice steady and resolute. "Let us get these applications open by the end of the week. I want the first round of students moving into their new apartments before the winter semester begins. Consider it done, Miss Hazel," Ethan replied, taking the folder with a respectful nod. He turned and walked out of the office, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him with a soft, solid click. I was entirely alone again in the massive, sunlit room. I walked over to the sleek private espresso bar nestled in the corner of my office. I selected a dark roast, ground the beans, and listened to the soothing, rhythmic hum of the machine as it brewed. The rich, earthy aroma filled the air, grounding me in the present moment. I poured the dark liquid into a simple ceramic mug, holding it in both hands to feel the comforting warmth radiating through the clay. I took a slow, deliberate sip, closing my eyes. It tasted like absolute, flawless victory, the kind of victory that does not require an audience or a round of applause to be validated. I walked back to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the endless blue expanse of Lake Michigan. My phone sat on my desk, completely silent. There were no frantic text messages demanding money. There were no manipulative voicemails begging for forgiveness. There were no legal threats, no toxic guilt trips, no reminders of a family that never truly existed. The silence was absolute perfection. For years, I had falsely believed that success was a weapon you used to force your abusers to finally respect you. I thought if I built a large enough company, amassed enough wealth, or gained enough power, they would eventually look at me and realize they had been wrong. But standing here at the absolute pinnacle of my industry, I finally understood the greatest truth of all. True power is not forcing toxic people to respect you. True power is realizing their respect is entirely worthless. Richard, Patricia, and Felicity were currently sitting in a decaying trailer park, drowning in their own manufactured misery, and I did not feel a single ounce of pity or regret. They were completely erased from my reality. I had cut the emotional anchor they had wrapped around my neck and watched them sink to the bottom of the ocean. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the quiet peace of the morning wash over me. I was Hazel Vanguard. I was the architect of my own destiny, the protector of my own peace, and the sole author of my future. I had survived their fire and forged myself into unbreakable steel. The city of Chicago buzzed below me, full of endless opportunities and unwritten chapters. The sweet revenge was finally over, and my truly free life had just begun.